But Canon John, would you like to come and come up to the lectern here? And,
Father John has a little setup to do, so as it's fairly warm in here, I would open the doors, but that makes the air conditioning system go into a rage and hot areas.
and
Get up, move while Father John sets up, and get the blood moving again.
And while Father John's doing that, I'll just give you a little introduction to him for those of you who won't know him. Canon John Udris is presently spiritual director at St Mary's College, Oscott, the seminary there. He has a license in spiritual theology from the Angelicum University in Rome. He's written on the spirituality of St Therese of Lisieux and was on the planning committee for the visit of her relics to this country in 2009. And I well remember standing in the queue, waiting to go into the cathedral to venerate the relics, and who kept coming up on the screen? Father John. He was parish priest here at St Teresa's here in Beaconsfield between 1996 and 2003. Gosh, I can't believe it's that long ago. And his love for Chesterton developed during those years. I first met him going into the presbytery, into the lounge there to see him, and there he was sat with a book on Chesterton. He's a priest of the Northampton diocese here, and he was asked in the summer of 2011, this is the bit that we're really interested in, to conduct a preliminary investigation into Chesterton. So it is a preliminary investigation into Chesterton by the Bishop of Northampton, who you've all met, the wonderful Bishop Peter Doyle, in response to petitions to open his cause for canonisation. It's a much more polite way of putting it. I called it badgering, didn't I? So, I think, are you nearly ready now?
I think I am.
Do you want me to recite any poetry or?
Peter, if I switch on the mic, is that okay? Can I talk to you while I set up?
Who won this?
Switch it off. Is that better? Great. So just as I get the machinery working, just a few things. First maybe would be to invite any of you who feel you'd like to be in touch with me about the investigation to do so, to feel you can bombard me with as many emails as you like, because they're coming through thick and fast. And my email address is Chesterton at Oscott, OSCOTT.org. Chesterton at Oscott.org. And so really what I'm looking for, what I'm doing in this preliminary investigation for Bishop Peter is essentially taking the temperature of the international, let's call it devotion, to Chesterton. So really part of my brief is to give Bishop Peter a sense of how wide that devotion is at present across the world. How long has that been? For how long has that been the case? So it's in that area that I'd particularly invite you to make your contributions in terms of how has Chesterton been influential in your life by way of a kind of testimonial, if you like. Would you say you have a devotion to him? We'll come back to that in a moment. Have you sought his intercessions? Have you had those prayers answered? That sort of area that I'd be really interested in receiving a contribution from you. Also, though you may have reservations, and that's part of this too. I want to hear from those who really do have some reservations as to this process. and I have received those, although I have to say, not as many as I would have expected. But I mean, seriously, this is, you know, meant to be giving Bishop Peter a sense of the present state of play. Clearly, there are reservations. If you have them, let me hear about them, because they'll all go into this dossier that I'm compiling. And just in terms of the sort of time frame here, I'm giving myself about a year, or just over, depending on how much, obviously, it's fitting it in with everything else. So it just depends on just how much time I do get to do it. But I want to do a good job, a good enough job, so that even if the cause isn't opened this time round, there'll be a good, solid chunk of stuff in the archive for when, because when, I think, not if, that swell comes again. Okay, so basically, what I see myself as doing, essentially, is covering the territory that a postulator will have to cover when that cause is finally introduced. Okay, so that's my brief. What you're going to hear from me, though, is not too much detachment, I'm afraid, in the sense that it'll become very obvious where I stand, and Bishop Peter knows where I stand on this myself. Let's just see if we can fire up the machinery. So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing, some of you may be wondering, what could I read? What could I read that would be useful in terms of this holiness? Is that coming right around the right way? So I'd recommend two books that I found really, really important and significant, and they are The Holiness of Chesterton, or The Holiness of G.K. Chesterton, might be called. Martin, is that your case? Yeah. Could I just put that on there? So that's the book edited by William Udris, is still here, which was the collation, really, essentially, of the papers of the, was it the 2007-8 symposium in Oxford? But it's really, really good. Recommend that. And I recommend too, Bob Wilde's book, The Tumbler of God, Chesterton as Mystic. A little bit maybe heavy at the beginning, but it really warms up well. I think it's a beautiful book, and so I highly recommend that too. Right, let's just see if we can put that, raise that up a bit. I mean, essentially, if you can't see the images, don't worry. It's just really to give you something rather than me to look at, really. Okay, so here we are. Now, it may be that you want to ask me some more direct questions around that investigation. I'm happy to receive those questions after, but the particular presentation I'm going to do is a kind of indirect, it's coming at this in a different kind of way, and one I hope you'll find helpful, not just in terms of getting our head around the possible cause being opened, but also just about our own road to holiness, really. Because as I think Dermot was saying earlier, that's what this is about. Saints beget saints. And that's perhaps their acid test, you know. The holiness of Chesterton is something that's infectious. And that's what I want to propose to you. But I want to go about it in a way, in a roundabout way, by saying this. If a man is known by the company he keeps or the friends he chooses,
this is true of his favorite saints and heroes too. And so it's not without significance that Chesterton wrote biographies, as we've heard, on such people as Chaucer and Blake and Dickens and Browning, as well as Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas. And I'm sure you know too, biographies which all seem so much more revealing of the author than of the hero about whom he is writing. So now, in conversation with my students, I'm often asking them, who are their favorite saints? And trying to get them to figure out why. Because that attraction is never accidental. So I think it's a really fruitful, maybe prayerful exercise to attend to the holy ones to whom we feel mysteriously drawn. Because the call of God is in that chemistry. They clearly spark something in us, and it's always worthwhile asking why. And I want to say that they often spell the specific direction in which the Lord wants to lead us. They often outline the sort of contours of the sanctity to which he is calling us. And sometimes, initially, by actually contradicting us. So, for example, you've heard my favorite saint happens to be the one to whom this parish is dedicated, Therese of Lisieux. But it wasn't after some years of studying her and writing books about her that it began to dawn on me why. It was because I sensed in her a kind of kindred spirit, someone who possessed the characteristics I lacked but wanted to emulate, and who could be a kind of patron in helping to bring those qualities to birth in me, like confidence, boldness, trust, daring. And I want to say today that in a similar way, Chesterton's personal patron saints can give us a powerful insight into his own holiness and an appreciation of the distinct profile of his own sanctity. So what I want to do over the next half an hour is to look at just a few of his favorite saints. Happily, the ones that have windows here in Chesterton's parish church. Sadly, the principal saint to whom the church is dedicated is not one of them. And there's a story behind that. All I'll say here is that Chesterton and Therese were almost exact contemporaries. She was born in 1873, he the following year. I believe they were very much, or are very much, soul twins. Their outlooks incredibly similar, and their spiritual priorities precisely the same. Humility, gratitude, that grace of a second childhood. But I think Chesterton only perhaps began to realize this shortly before he died. And I think largely, if my hunch is right, due to the influence of his secretary, Dorothy Collins. However, we're not going to talk about Therese, maybe another occasion. But the first of his favorite saints I want to focus on was actually someone for whom he had a special love, just like Therese. another young French warrior of a woman, Joan of Arc. And if you haven't had a chance to go into the church, I think the window is on the right-hand side, if I remember, sort of nearer to the back than the front. And the text in that window, at the bottom of the window, I think captures one of the qualities that G.K. admired in Joan. The text is, "I must go, so I will go." I think that could have been a bit of a motto for Chesterton too. I must go, so I will go. In terms of his various commitments to the various battles, as it were, in which he valiantly took up verbal arms. So here's some of what Chesterton writes about this saint. Joan of Arc was not stuck at the crossroads either by rejecting all the paths like Tolstoy or by accepting them all like Nietzsche. She chose a path and went down it like a thunderbolt. Just over lunch, I was talking to my friend from Italy, and he described Chesterton, or the effect that Chesterton has on us, as like a thunderbolt. Here he describes Joan like that. When I came to think of her, Joan had in her all that was true, either in Tolstoy or Nietzsche, all that was even tolerable in either of them. I thought of all that is noble in Tolstoy, the pleasure in plain things, especially in plain pity, the actualities of the earth, the reverence for the poor, the dignity of the bowed back. Joan of Arc had all that, and with this great addition, that she endured poverty as well as admiring it. And then I thought of all that was brave and proud in Nietzsche and his mutiny against the emptiness and timidity of our time. I thought of his cry for the ecstatic equilibrium of danger, his hunger for the rush of great horses, his cry to arms. Well, says Chesterton, Joan of Arc had all that, and again with this difference, that she did not praise fighting, but fought. Do you see how the description of Joan, and actually of Tolstoy and Nietzsche, for that matter, give us a glimpse into G.K.'s own sanctity? And first of all, it lies in his attraction towards taking up a cause, with a courage that carries one all the way, that thrusts one into the fray without, as it were, your right hand knowing what your left hand is doing, without the sort of self-consciousness that so often results in getting stuck at the crossroads in the kind of paralysis that meant that ultimately neither Tolstoy nor Nietzsche actually embodied their ideals to the death in a way that Joan did. But here again is a feature of Chesterton's holiness that he recognizes, we might say, the seeds of sanctity and sanity, both in Tolstoy and Nietzsche too. For example, in Tolstoy's pleasure in plain things and reverence for the poor, and Nietzsche's mutiny against the emptiness and timidity of our time, and his cry to arms. See, all of these are hints at Chesterton's own heroic attitudes. When St. Teresa was built, Chesterton had cherished the hope that it be named after the English martyrs. The story I heard was that he was disappointed when it was decided to be dedicated to St. Teresa. But, as I'm sure you know now, Thomas More and John Fisher are both secondary patrons to the parish, and they appear in the window above the high altar. Here's the window of Thomas More. He was a huge source of inspiration for Chesterton. I can't remember now who it was who said that at the time of Chesterton's death that he was the greatest Englishman since Thomas More. I don't remember who that was, but yeah. Chesterton writes about this saint in The Well and the Shallows, and here he says, what terrified King Henry VIII about Thomas More was the clarity of his mind. So listen to Chesterton. More's mind was like a diamond, like a power cutting glass, cutting through things that seemed equally transparent, but were at once less solid and less many-sided. He goes on, a mind like More's was full of light, like a house made of windows, but the windows looked out on all sides and in all directions. Now, Chesterton was certainly not thinking of himself there at all. But I do want to say that what he admired in More and what drew him to More was the same sanity, the same sanctity to which he himself felt called, and towards which I'm sure he implored More's intercession. But aren't those words, and to use Dermot's phrase there, in a deep and mysterious way, a reflection of Chesterton himself? One of his chief charisms is that he had a mind able to cut through things, a mind full of light, because it was made of windows that look out in all directions. In other words, a Catholic mind, a universal mind. And I, for one, have found myself increasingly praying to GK for a share in that graced clarity of mind. And it's in talking about Thomas More that Chesterton returns to another theme in his books, Heretics and Orthodoxy. Quoting More, a heresy is not often a mere lie. A heresy is not often a mere lie. Sorry, that's GK. Quoting More, never was there a heretic that spoke all false. A heresy is a truth that hides all the other truths. I think that's the origin of the only explicit reference to Chesterton that Pope Francis has made to date. Though I hope and feel sure there will be many more. Sorry for the pun. There is, of course, another St. Thomas. Oh, sorry, just a couple of slides there. There's another St. Thomas Chesterton loved, one with another huge mind and huge girth and huge innocence, Thomas Aquinas. But there aren't any windows of Aquinas in the church, so we'll pass him over and go to Chesterton's favourite saint of all. And I think maybe that's a bit puzzling and intriguing in itself when we realise that that favourite of all favourite saints of his was St. Francis of Assisi. Actually, he tells us that even from his boyhood, he was captivated by this figure. See, what I want to say is that God is in that captivation. God was in that captivation right then. It was telling Chesterton something about the journey he would be taken on. One of his earliest poems was about Francis and the mysterious hold he had over his heart, even in childhood. And in 1900, way before he was a Catholic, he wrote an article about Francis in the Speaker, and here's some of what he wrote. He expressed in loftier and bolder language, this is St. Francis, he expressed in loftier and bolder language than any earthly thinker the conception that laughter is as divine as tears. He never forgot to take pleasure in a bird as it flashed past him, or a drop of water as it fell from his fingers. He was perhaps the happiest of the sons of men. So here already in his mid-20s, Chesterton was pondering the fact that humour is holy. Laughter is literally divine. As he says somewhere, it's like akin with the ancient winds of inspiration. It's a part of who God is, and therefore who we are. For Chesterton, Francis was happy to be a fool, so forgetful of himself that he was actually so much more himself. Have you noticed that? When you let go of yourself and laugh, you know, we might look ridiculous, and that word comes from the word to laugh, doesn't it? But we actually are never so attractive, I think. You notice that when we laugh together, we draw close to each other. There's something about leaving ourselves behind and therefore inhabiting ourselves more fully. We're never so fully ourselves as when we forget ourselves. And laughter, and especially the ability to laugh at ourselves, which G.K. loved to do, is the proof of the truth of that. There's something holy about his hilarity, sensed Chesterton, calling him the jongleur de Dieu, the tumbler of God. But I think we sense that too about Chesterton. Do you know when he became a Catholic, not so far from here, the Railway Hotel was probably just about where Waitrose is now, just here. He took the confirmation name, Francis. And the first book he published as a Catholic was that book on Francis of Assisi. And so many of its themes, I think, tell us why Chesterton found Francis so attractive, and they are all telltale features of Chesterton's own holiness, like courtesy. Just in the book, Chesterton quotes these lovely lines from his friend Hilaire Belloc, by the way. There's Belloc there. This is the portrait of Baring and Belloc and Chesterton in the National Portrait Gallery. Do you remember the story? Perhaps you've heard it. When Chesterton first saw it, he said, there's Baring, there's overbearing, and there's past bearing. But here's Belloc on courtesy. Of courtesy, it is much less than courage of heart or holiness. Yet in my walks it seems to me that the grace of God is in courtesy. I always hear those lines and see Belloc walking with Chesterton, walking with courtesy. By the way, ironically, Belloc, I don't think, was known for his courtesy. But in the context of courtesy, Chesterton tells the story of how, even before Francis's conversion, when he was languishing in prison with his fellow companions, having failed miserably in their military adventure against the Perugians, how there was in that prison someone everyone else shunned. And perhaps it was the person whose mistakes or cowardice or whatever lost them the battle. But while everyone else shunned that person, Francis treated him just as he treated everyone else, with that courtesy that Chesterton describes as this: a deep tide driving out to uncharted seas of charity. He liked as he liked. He seems to have liked everybody, but especially those whom everyone disliked him for liking. ringing any bells? He acted out of an unconscious largeness. That's a word we've heard again and again today, isn't it? Largeness, wideness, spaciousness. And again, although I'm certain Chesterton certainly wasn't meaning to, as well as describing Francis, he was describing himself. Because one of the things that even his fiercest opponents were struck by was that no matter how contentious they were in debate, he never, ever disrespected them. There was never any rancor. And he would always want deliberately and seek out the good in the other person's argument so as to be able to connect. And so it's well known, isn't it, that the fiercest opponents, were Shaw and Chesterton on the debating stage, and off it they were the fiercest friends. What an icon, really, that friendship is for us. I heard a lovely story about Shaw. I wonder if you've heard it. I'd never heard it before. Apparently, Shaw was teasing Chesterton about his weight one day and said, Mr. Chesterton, you look as though you're pregnant. And so Gilbert says, well, if it's a boy, I shall call it George. And if it's a girl, I shall call it Bernadette. And if it's just wind, I shall call it George Bernard Shaw. But they really loved each other. They really loved each other. How important those friendships are in the spread of the gospel. Take another one, H.G. Wells. Do you know the story of Wells saying to Chesterton, if in all my atheology you turn out to be right, I hope I will be able to get into heaven by having been a friend of yours. And then Chesterton even more wonderfully replies to him, if I, with all my theology, turn out to be right, you will get into heaven not by being a friend of mine, but by being a friend of man. Whoa, that is beautiful. I think it's what Pope Francis has been saying. By the way, I just have such a strong hunch that Pope Francis is a Chestertonian, and I'm hoping we might get a green light from the top, but but what a role model I think Chesterton can be for us in terms of authentic dialogue between believers and unbelievers, and believers and agnostics, a real patron for the courtyard of the Gentiles, for interfaith dialogue, a real icon for the new evangelization. And all without ceasing to be a searing, at the same time, a searing and uncompromising apologist for the faith. Perhaps we can hear that word courtesy actually comes from the word court, as in the manners of the court. And again, about St. Francis, Chesterton writes, whereas in a court there is one king and 100 courtiers, in this story, Francis's, and I would say Chesterton's, there was one courtier moving among 100 kings. He treated each person and indeed each thing as a king, and as we heard earlier, and a reflection of the king. He honored everyone. That profound reverence marked his approach to everyone. When I was a parish priest here, between 96 and 2003, there were still two ladies living who had faint memories of Chesterton. Father Francis this morning mentioned Mari and how she was hidden behind Chesterton at Mass so that Monsignor couldn't see her. There's another lovely lady called Lucy Maguire. Some of you will remember Maureen. And Lucy had a lovely story where she said she, as a young girl, had gone mushroom picking for the Chestertons and had delivered the mushrooms to the back door, and was skipping up the garden path, and Mrs. Chesterton called her back and said, "Lucy, my husband wants to meet you." And Lucy remembers feeling kind of totally overawed at the prospect of meeting the great man. But she said when she entered his study, he got out of his chair in such a way and greeted her in such a way that it made her feel that she was far, far more important, and that he was far more honored and overawed to meet her than she him. I think that's very, very telling. Of St. Francis, he writes, Chesterton writes, "From the Pope to the beggar, from the Sultan of Syria to ragged robbers, there was never a man who looked into those brown burning eyes without being certain that Francis Bernardone was really interested in him, that he was being valued and taken seriously." And that was so true of Chesterton too. Which ushers us into another important theme of that book and aspect of I think, both Francis and Chesterton's sanctity, and it is that he didn't want to see the wood for the trees, in the sense that each tree mattered, in the sense that, he didn't speak of Mother Nature in that generalized way, but like Francis, Sister Earth in that specific way. So his relationship was not to birds in general, but to this one or that one. And his love not for the brotherhood of man in general, but to the brother in front of him right now. Let me move on to just to say that that's a theme that's not only the theme of the poetry of St. Francis, it's the poetry of G.K. Chesterton too. Seeing the wonder in the uniqueness and unrepeatability and here and nowness of each part of God's creation. So, for example, in his poem, A Second Childhood, he talks about a child's blessed ability to stare at things and be surprised and overawed. Just a couple of stanzas from that poem. "When all my days are ending and I have no song to sing, I think I shall not be too old to stare at everything, as I stared once at a nursery door or a tall tree in a swing." We heard about the trees earlier, didn't we? Well, here's that in this verse. "Wherein God's ponderous mercy hangs on all my sins and me, because he does not take away the terror from the tree, and stones still shine along the road that are and cannot be." Just love that poem. But that's what Francis meant to Chesterton, that he helped him look at things in a new way. And that's, as we've seen today, is what Chesterton in his turn has helped us to do, I think. And therein lies his holiness. Again, about Francis, he says, he gives a sort of halo to the edges of all earthly things. Isn't that what Chesterton does for us? I've got some cards for you later that have on them the window from the church, the memorial window to Gilbert and to his wife. And on the reverse side, I put a quotation that we've heard already today, in fact, a couple of times. And it's a description of another key dimension of his favorite saint, and I want to say it's a key dimension of Chesterton's own sanctity. Someone has described Chesterton's spirituality as a mysticism of gratitude. I think Francis of Assisi taught Chesterton from an early age to thank his way through each day. And so that even in his agnostic days, he couldn't quite bring himself to believe that there was nobody to thank for the wonder of existence. So this is the quote. He's describing Francis, but I want to say it's a description of Chesterton. He was above all things a great giver, and he cared chiefly for the best kind of giving, which is called thanksgiving. If another man wrote a grammar of assent, he may well be said to have written a grammar of acceptance, a grammar of gratitude. He understood down to its very depths the theory of thanks, and its depths are a bottomless abyss. He's referring here, obviously, to the recently beatified Newman. And I might say how many potential parallels there are between Chesterton and Newman in terms of the story of both their possible eventual canonizations. But again, that description of Francis is perfect description of himself. He was, above all, a great giver. And I, for one, have felt the force of his influence and intercession in that particular area of my life, upping my appreciation of things, for which I'll be eternally grateful. In his wonderful, just to close, in his wonderful book, little book on Thomas Aquinas, he writes, "It is," and we've heard this too, I think, today, "it is the paradox of history that each generation is converted by the saint who contradicts it most." And J.K. had Francis in mind when he wrote those words. I always have Chesterton in mind when I hear those words. He goes on to say, the saint is a medicine because he is an antidote. He will generally be found restoring the world to sanity by exaggerating whatever the world neglects, which is by no means always the same in every age. Might not Chesterton be the timely tonic for our own age?